Have you ever felt that deep uneasiness when looking at certain relationships in your life? That disturbing sensation that something isn't right, that you're being drained, diminished, prevented from becoming who you truly are? Friedrich Nietzsche, one of history's most provocative and insightful philosophers, not only felt this but dedicated much of his work to understanding the human relationships that imprison us. He realized something few dare to admit. Some people in our lives aren't there to elevate us but to keep us small, weak, domesticated. Today, I'll reveal the 6 types of people Nietzsche would advise you to abandon, not out of anger or resentment, but out of love for your own greatness, your own evolution. This isn't a message of hatred, it's a call to authenticity, to the courage to live according to your highest values. If you've ever felt that certain relationships are hindering your growth, that you're compromising your truth to please others, then what I'm about to share may be exactly what you need to hear. The German philosopher of the 19th century wasn't just a critic of traditional morality. He was one of the first to perceive how certain types of human relationships can create an invisible prison for our spirit. When Nietzsche spoke about the will to power, he wasn't referring to dominion over others but to the ability to master oneself, to overcome one's own limitations. And some people, consciously or not, become obstacles on this path. The first type of person Nietzsche would advise you to abandon is what I'll call the passive nihilist. This is the eternal pessimist, the one who not only sees the world as empty of meaning, but who revels in this emptiness. Nietzsche identified nihilism as one of the great crises of his time, the perception that God is dead, and with this, all traditional values have lost their foundation. But he distinguished 2 types of responses to this crisis: passive nihilism and active nihilism. The passive nihilist, upon realizing that old values no longer hold up, simply gives up. They fall into despair, cynicism, apathy. Why try? Nothing matters anyway. You know this type of person, the one who, faced with any new idea or enthusiasm, responds with a condescending smile and a sarcastic comment, who drains your energy with their constant negativity, who transforms any effort into useless before you even begin. Nietzsche would write in his private notebooks, "The passive nihilist is like a dead weight tied to the swimmer's ankle. Not only does he not swim, but he prevents others from swimming." For Nietzsche, nihilism shouldn't be an end, but a beginning. The recognition that old values have crumbled should be the starting point for creating new and more authentic values. The passive nihilist, however, never reaches this creative phase. He drowns in his own hopelessness and tries to drag everyone around him into the same abyss. Perhaps you recognize this pattern in someone close to you, that person who, when you share a dream, immediately lists all the reasons why it will fail, who responds to any creative effort with, "What's the point?" Who discredits not just the possibility of change, but the very idea that life can have meaning. For Nietzsche, this type of person is dangerous, not because their ideas are necessarily wrong, but because they've become paralyzed in the diagnosis without advancing to treatment. And worse, they try to paralyze everyone around them. The second type Nietzsche would advise us to abandon is the preacher of equality. This person, driven by a subtle form of resentment, advocates that everyone should be equal, not in rights or opportunities, which would be fair, but in capacity, ambition, and achievement. They cannot bear others' excellence and instead of elevating themselves, prefer to pull others down. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote, "They have something they are proud of. What do they call it? That which makes them proud? Education, they call it. It is what distinguishes them from the goat herds. That is why they dislike hearing the word contempt applied to them. So I will appeal to their pride. I will speak to them of what is most contemptible, but that is the last man." This last man is Nietzsche's representation of the perfect conformist, one who aspires to nothing grandiose, who ridicules anyone who stands out, who believes he has invented happiness by eliminating all risk, all challenge, all greatness from life. You know this type. It's the person who, when you begin to stand out, subtly tries to put you in your place, who disguises envy as concern. Aren't you working too hard? Do you really need that? Why not be content with what you have like everyone else? The preacher of equality cannot tolerate that someone in their circle seeks excellence because it exposes their own complacency. They prefer a world where no one flies high because they don't have the courage to spread their own wings. Nietzsche understood that this type of person is especially dangerous because their words seem virtuous. After all, who can be against equality? But he perceived the malice hidden behind this apparent virtue. The preacher of equality doesn't want to elevate the disadvantaged. They want to bring down the exceptional. They don't seek a society where everyone has opportunities to grow, but one where no one dares grow too much. If you're surrounded by people who constantly diminish your ambitions, who make you feel guilty for wanting more, who use phrases like, Who do you think you are? Then you're dealing with preachers of equality. And Nietzsche would say, step away, not out of hatred, but because these people represent the opposite of what he called the will to power, the vital force that drives us to overcome ourselves, to seek our highest version. The third type to abandon is the resentful moralist. This is perhaps the archenemy in Nietzsche's philosophy. In his work on the genealogy of morality, he traces the origin of what he calls slave morality, a value system born not from love of life, but from resentment against it. The resentful moralist is one who, unable to affirm their own existence, creates an elaborate moral system where their weakness is virtue and others' strength is vice. What is good? Asks Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil. All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that resistance is overcome. The resentful moralist inverts these values. For them, the good is the weak, the submissive, the obedient, not because these qualities are truly admirable, but because they are the qualities they possess, and the bad is the strong, the assertive, the independent, not because these qualities are truly despicable, but because they are the ones they envy. You recognize this type of person. It's the one who is constantly judging others for living fully, who transforms their own timidity into modesty, and condemns others' expressiveness as showing off, who makes their inability to say no a virtue called selflessness, and judges others' healthy boundaries as selfishness. The resentful moralist has no values of their own. They only have reactions against others' values. Nietzsche warned that this type of person is particularly dangerous because they present themselves cloaked in virtue. They don't say, I envy your strength. They say, your strength is immoral. They don't admit, I'm afraid to live fully. Instead, they proclaim, living fully is sinful. Their morality isn't born from love of life, but from fear of it. For Nietzsche, abandoning the resentful moralist isn't just a matter of personal well-being, but of philosophical integrity. Remaining under these people's influence is allowing your own worldview to be distorted, your values subverted by those whose only real value is resentment. The fourth type Nietzsche would advise us to leave behind is the unconscious conformist. This is the individual who lives entirely within the herd, who has never questioned the values they've adopted, who repeats opinions as if they were their own, and judges others based on norms they've never examined. They are what Nietzsche called the herdman, not necessarily evil or stupid, but deeply unconscious. The herd consciousness, wrote Nietzsche, speaks and commands in all those whom we've been taught to consider responsible, and the responsible one ends up believing that consciousness is precisely the responsibility that has been instilled in them. In other words, the unconscious conformist believes they think for themselves, when in fact they're just repeating what they've been programmed to think. You know this type. It's the person who never questions the customs of the society they were born into, who judges others based not on values they've consciously chosen, but on norms they've passively absorbed, who becomes genuinely perplexed when you act outside the expected social script and asks, with sincere confusion, why don't you do like everyone else? The problem with the unconscious conformist isn't that they follow social norms. We all follow some. The problem is that they've never questioned these norms, never placed them under the microscope of reason, never asked, why do we live this way? Could it be different? Does this way of life really serve my human flourishing? For Nietzsche, an unexamined life, as Socrates would say, isn't worth living. And spending time with those who've never examined their own lives is risking being dragged into the same state of unconsciousness. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you, warned the philosopher. Similarly, when you spend too much time with unconscious conformists, you risk losing your own consciousness. The fifth type to abandon is the emotional vampire. This is a type Nietzsche didn't explicitly name, but which is implicit in all his philosophy about strength and weakness in human relationships. The emotional vampire is one who, unable to generate their own vital force, feeds off yours. It's the chronically negative person who sucks your energy, who turns every interaction into a drama where they are the victim, who never reciprocates the support they receive, who sees your achievements as threats. Although Nietzsche didn't use the modern term emotional vampire, he deeply understood the dynamics of what he called psychological parasitism. In The Antichrist, he writes, wherever the influence of theologians has been felt, value judgments have been stood on their head, and the concepts of true and false are necessarily inverted. Whatever is most harmful to life is called true, and whatever elevates it, intensifies it, affirms it, justifies it, and makes it triumphant is called false. Replacing theologians with emotional vampires, we have a perfect description. These people invert all healthy values. transform assertiveness into aggression, joy into frivolity, strength into oppression, independence into abandonment. Their world is a continuous distortion where everything exists to reinforce their role as perpetual victim. You recognize this type. It's the person you avoid calling because you know that, by the end of the conversation, you'll feel completely drained. It's that friend who always has a crisis when you have an achievement. It's the family member who turns every gathering into a drama centered on their difficulties. It's someone who systematically confuses intimacy with emotional overload and honesty with constant venting. For Nietzsche, the ability to generate your own strength is essential for an authentic life. "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," he wrote, suggesting that we should find strength within ourselves, not drain it from others. The emotional vampire, unable to do this, becomes a black hole of needs that no amount of support can fill. The sixth and last type Nietzsche would advise us to abandon is the false friend. This is perhaps the most painful to recognize, because it involves admitting that we've been deceived, sometimes for years. The false friend is one who stands by your side not because they value who you are, but because they need something you offer: status, connections, emotional support, validation, or simply an audience for their own drama. Nietzsche was extraordinarily insightful about the nature of authentic friendship. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he writes, "In a friend one should have one's best enemy. You should be closest to him with your heart when you resist him." For the philosopher, true friendship isn't based on mutual flattery or omitting uncomfortable truths, but on a shared commitment to growth and authenticity. The true friend isn't one who always agrees, but one who's willing to disagree when it serves your evolution. The false friend does exactly the opposite. They agree when they should disagree, praise when they should criticize, remain silent when they should speak, not because they love you, but because they fear losing the benefits they get from the relationship. It's the friend who disappears when you're in difficulty, who approaches only when they need something, who smiles to your face and speaks ill behind your back, who pretends to support your dreams while secretly hoping for your failure. Identifying this type is particularly difficult because, unlike the obvious emotional vampire or the clearly resentful moralist, the false friend is a master of disguise. They are, as Nietzsche might say, actors on a stage, playing the role of friend while serving only their own interests. How to recognize them then? Nietzsche would suggest observing not what they say, but what they do. Not their words of support, but their concrete actions. Not their praise in easy moments, but their presence in difficult times. He who climbs the ladder must always be forgiven if he forgets the face of him who helped him, wrote the philosopher. The false friend is exactly this: one who forgets your face as soon as you're no longer useful for their purposes. Now that I've identified the 6 types of people Nietzsche would advise abandoning, the question naturally arises: how to do this? How to cut ties that might be decades old, that might involve family members, that are deeply intertwined in your life? The Nietzschean answer isn't simple or comfortable, but it's deeply liberating. Through the transvaluation of values, the German philosopher realized that many of our actions are determined by values we've absorbed without questioning, and one of the most powerful is the value of loyalty at all costs. We're taught that abandoning relationships is always wrong, always a failure, always a demonstration of weakness or selfishness. Nietzsche would say, question this value. True loyalty isn't what keeps you bound to toxic relationships, but what you have to yourself, to your own growth, to your own truth. Sometimes the most courageous act isn't to stay, but to leave. Become what you are, was the Nietzschean imperative, borrowed from Pindar. And sometimes to become who you truly are, you need to leave behind those who only know and only accept earlier, smaller versions of you. Those who would rather see you diminished than transformed, who would prefer you remain familiar, even if unhappy, than see you grow beyond the role they've assigned you. This abandonment doesn't need to be dramatic or hostile. It's not about confrontation, but about gradual distancing, about establishing firm boundaries, about reducing the access these people have to your energy, your time, your emotional resources. As Nietzsche would say, it's not about defeating the enemy, but about overcoming them, transcending them through your own growth. And here's the deepest part of the Nietzschean vision. These 6 types of people we need to abandon aren't just external individuals. They're also aspects of ourselves. The passive nihilist in us who gives up before starting, the internal preacher of equality who is afraid of our own greatness, the resentful moralist within us who judges others to avoid facing our own failures, the conformist we prefer to be when independent thought seems too frightening, the emotional vampire we sometimes become when we don't know how to generate our own strength, and the false friend we are to ourselves when we betray our deepest values in the name of social convenience. Abandoning these 6 types of people is ultimately abandoning the limited and limiting versions of who we are. It's creating space for what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, not a superman in the sense of superhuman powers, but a human being who has overcome their own limitations, who has created their own authentic values, who has learned to say yes to life in all its complexity, pain, and beauty. When you free yourself from these relationships that diminish you, what emerges isn't isolation, but the possibility of more authentic connections. Relationships based not on need, dependency, or habit, but on conscious choice, mutual respect, and shared values. Nietzsche, often misunderstood as a misanthrope, was actually a profound connoisseur of human nature who believed in the transformative potential of authentic relationships. Our greatest experiences, he wrote, are our quietest hours, and sometimes the silence left by the abandonment of those who diminish us becomes the sacred space where we can finally hear our own voice, recognize our deepest values, and begin the journey of becoming who we truly are. Have you ever abandoned any of these 6 types of people in your life, or do you realize now that you need to do so? Share in the comments your experience with the transvaluation of these relationships. Subscribe to this channel for more profound analyses of how the great philosophers can illuminate our modern dilemmas. There's a video right after this one about how Nietzsche teaches us to transform suffering into strength. Don't miss it. Remember, abandoning what diminishes you isn't cowardice. It's the greatest courage. It isn't failure. It's transcendence. It isn't an end, but the true beginning of an authentic life. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next dimension. But before I go deeper, let me ask you this. Have you noticed how some relationships in your life seem to exist only to keep you small? That friend who subtly undermines your ambitions, that family member who makes you feel guilty for growing beyond their expectations, that partner who seems threatened by your independence? Nietzsche wasn't just a philosopher of abstract ideas. He was a profound psychologist who understood that our relationships shape our becoming, and some relationships, he would argue, shape us into diminished versions of ourselves. What makes Nietzsche's perspective so revolutionary even today is that it challenges our conventional wisdom about human connections. We're taught that relationships should be preserved at all costs, that loyalty means staying, that abandonment is always a moral failure. But Nietzsche would ask, what if staying means betraying your highest potential? What if loyalty to others requires disloyalty to yourself? What if some connections need to be severed not because you failed at relationship, but because you're succeeding at becoming? The passive nihilist doesn't just drain your optimism, they attack the very foundation of meaning-making itself. They're not merely pessimistic, they're actively hostile to the idea that anything could have value. Why bother? Isn't just their question, it's their weapon. Every time you build something, they're there with their acid rain of cynicism to erode it. They see your enthusiasm not as misguided but as threatening, because your ability to find meaning exposes their choice to embrace meaninglessness. Nietzsche understood that nihilism wasn't just a philosophical position, but a psychological strategy, a way to preemptively surrender so that one never has to risk failure. The passive nihilist has decided that nothing matters not after careful examination, but because mattering is frightening. It demands response, requires action, creates the possibility of disappointment. By declaring everything meaningless, they create an artificial safety where their inaction seems justified rather than cowardly. What makes them so dangerous to your growth is their insidious logic. If nothing matters, then your attempts to create meaning are not just futile, but ridiculous. Your efforts become not noble, but naive. Your passion becomes not inspiring, but embarrassing. And slowly, interaction by interaction, they wear down your resolve to find significance, to create value, to live purposefully in a universe that offers no ready-made purpose. This is why Nietzsche would advise their abandonment with particular urgency. The passive nihilist doesn't just disagree with your outlook, they threaten the psychological machinery that makes outlook possible. They don't just rain on your parade, they try to convince you that parades themselves are absurd, and if you spend enough time with them, you might start to believe it. The preacher of equality's danger lies in their camouflage of resentment as justice. They don't say, I'm envious of your excellence. They say, your excellence oppresses others. They don't admit, I'm afraid I can't achieve what you have. Instead, they proclaim, no one should achieve more than others. They transform their personal limitations into universal moral principles and their inability to rise into a virtue of not rising. Nietzsche saw through this moral masquerade with shocking clarity. On the Genealogy of Morality, he writes about what he calls ressentiment, a psychological state where the weak, unable to express their anger directly against the strong, create a moral system where weakness becomes goodness and strength becomes evil. The preacher of equality is ressentiment personified, turning their own inadequacy into righteousness and others' accomplishment into sin. What makes them particularly toxic in your life is how they attach themselves to legitimate moral concerns. They don't just say, don't excel, they say, Your excellence is harmful to others. They hijack the language of fairness, of justice, of community to mask what is essentially a demand for conformity. They weaponize guilt to keep you small, and if you listen to them long enough, you might mistake their fear for wisdom. This is precisely why Nietzsche would urge you to create distance from them. Not because equality itself is wrong. Nietzsche would likely support equality of opportunity and dignity, but because their version of equality is a downward leveling. They don't want to elevate those who struggle. They want to hamper those who thrive. They don't celebrate when others rise. They feel relief when others fall. Their equality isn't about lifting humanity. It's about ensuring no one rises too far above them. The resentful moralist is perhaps Nietzsche's most recognized enemy, the embodiment of what he called slave morality. They are moral architects who build ethical systems not from love of goodness but from hatred of power. They preach humility not because they value modesty but because they resent greatness. They advocate selflessness not because they care for others but because they fear the confident self. They condemn desire not because they've transcended it but because they're terrified by its force. What makes them so insidious in your life is their ability to make you feel guilty for your very vitality. Every time you express joy, ambition, pride, or desire, they're there with a moral judgment to make you question yourself. Isn't that a bit selfish? Do you really need that much? You seem very full of yourself today. They constrain your expansion with moral handcuffs, all while presenting themselves as ethical exemplars. Nietzsche saw this morality for what it was, life denial disguised as virtue. In Twilight of the Idols, he writes, "When we speak of values, we speak under the inspiration, under the optics of life. Life itself forces us to establish values. Life itself values through us when we establish values." The resentful moralist reverses this process. Instead of deriving morality from what enhances life, they define life's enhancement as immoral. This is why Nietzsche would advocate their abandonment with particular emphasis. The resentful moralist doesn't just disagree with your choices. They undermine your moral autonomy itself. They don't just question your actions. They poison the wellspring from which your actions flow. And if you remain in their sphere of influence, you risk internalizing a morality that turns against your own flourishing. The unconscious conformist's danger lies in their contagious sleep. They aren't malicious or manipulative, they're simply unawake. But their slumber has a gravitational pull. They've never questioned the scripts they follow, the values they uphold, the lives they lead, and they become genuinely confused, even disturbed, when you begin to question yours. Nietzsche's concept of the herd animal wasn't just about people who follow norms, but about those who have so thoroughly internalized social expectations that they experience them as natural law. When you suggest that things could be different, that our customs are made, not found, they don't just disagree, they feel threatened at an existential level. Their world requires universal participation to maintain its appearance of inevitability. What makes them hazardous to your growth is their unconscious enforcement of conformity. They don't need to actively police you. Their very confusion at your divergence creates a constant social pressure. That's not how things are done. People will think you're strange. Why can't you just be normal? These aren't arguments. They're expressions of genuine disorientation when someone steps outside the boundaries they've never even perceived as boundaries. This is why Nietzsche would advise creating distance from them. The unconscious conformist isn't just a person who makes different choices. They're a walking embodiment of unexamined life. And as Socrates, whom Nietzsche both criticized and respected, famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." By remaining close to those who've never questioned, you risk having your own questioning atrophy. Their certainty, born not of reflection but of its absence, can dull your capacity for critical thought. The emotional vampire's danger is the most physically palpable. After spending time with them, you feel not just mentally but physically drained, your energy depleted, your enthusiasm dimmed, your resources exhausted. They don't just disagree with you or judge you. They feed off you. Your vitality becomes their sustenance, your joy their nourishment, your strength their meal. What makes them particularly difficult to abandon is that they often present themselves as victims who desperately need your help. They're not explicitly demanding, they're implicitly pleading. Their lives are always in crisis, their needs always urgent, their suffering always paramount. And if you're naturally empathetic, they know exactly how to hook into your compassion and transform it from a gift freely given into a resource compulsively drained. Nietzsche, with his emphasis on vitality and self-overcoming, would be particularly adamant about distancing yourself from emotional vampires. His concept of the will to power wasn't about dominating others, but about the drive to overcome oneself, to grow, to expand, and this requires tremendous psychic energy. The emotional vampire doesn't just make you momentarily tired, they deplete the very resource you need for your own becoming. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "I love him who wants to create beyond himself and thus perishes." Creation requires energy, the energy to imagine, to build, to persevere through resistance. The emotional vampire leaves you with barely enough energy to maintain, let alone create. They don't just take your time or attention, they take your potential futures by draining the force needed to bring them into being. The false friend's danger is the most heartbreaking because it involves betrayal of trust. They aren't openly antagonistic like the resentful moralist, or overtly draining like the emotional vampire. They present themselves as allies, as supporters, as people who have your best interests at heart, but their loyalty is conditional on you remaining useful, convenient, or unthreatening to them. What makes them so difficult to identify is that their betrayal often happens in your absence. To your face, they're encouraging. Behind your back, they're undermining. When you succeed, they offer congratulations while secretly resenting your rise. When you struggle, they offer sympathy while secretly enjoying your fall. Their connection to you isn't based on who you are, but on what you provide. Status by association, a willing ear, a reliable supporter, a steady provider, or simply someone who makes them feel better by comparison. Nietzsche, who experienced profound friendship betrayal in his own life, particularly with Richard Wagner, understood the unique pain of discovering that someone you trusted was wearing a mask. In Human, All Too Human, he writes about friendship with remarkable insight. A good friend who has found the right words for your matter is usually more convincing than you are yourself because you have greater immediacy and are always moved by more reasons than you can express. The false friend inverts this dynamic. Instead of finding the right words for your matter, they find the words that serve their interests. Instead of helping you express your reasons, they subtly redirect the conversation to their concerns. Their friendship isn't a space where you become more articulate to yourself. It's a space where you become more useful to them. This is why Nietzsche would advocate their abandonment with particular care. The false friend doesn't just waste your time or drain your energy, they distort your self-understanding. Their selective feedback, their conditional support, their strategic availability, all create a funhouse mirror where you see, not yourself, but the version of you that serves them best. And the longer you look into this mirror, the more you risk forgetting your actual reflection. The process of abandoning these 6 types isn't about dramatic confrontations or righteous denouncements. Nietzsche would likely advocate a quieter, more deliberate approach, what he might call a revaluation of values in your personal relationships. This begins not with changing others, but with changing how you value and engage with them. Start by recognizing that distance isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's the most honest response to incompatibility. Reduce your availability gradually. Set clearer boundaries around your time, your emotional labor, your resources. Be unavailable for the dynamics that diminish you. When the passive nihilist begins their litany of "why bother?" Don't argue. Simply don't engage. When the preacher of equality tries to make you feel guilty for your ambitions, don't justify. Simply continue pursuing excellence. When the resentful moralist attempts to shame your joy, don't defend. Simply remain joyful. This process isn't about changing them. Nietzsche was deeply skeptical about our ability to change others. It's about changing the relationship itself. Relationships exist in the space between people, and by altering your position, you necessarily transform that space. Some relationships will naturally fade when you stop playing your assigned role. Others will adapt to your new boundaries. A few, the ones worth keeping, might even evolve into something more authentic. The most profound insight Nietzsche offers on this journey is that abandoning these 6 types isn't just about external relationships, it's about internal liberation. Each of these types represents not just people we know, but tendencies within ourselves. We all have moments of passive nihilism, of resentful moralism, of emotional vampirism. The process of freeing ourselves from these external influences is simultaneously the process of transcending these aspects of ourselves. This is the deeper meaning of what Nietzsche called self-overcoming. It's not just about becoming stronger or more accomplished. It's about becoming more integrated, more authentic, more fully yourself. And sometimes that means leaving behind not just the people who keep you small, but the parts of yourself that have grown accustomed to smallness. The ultimate goal isn't isolation. Nietzsche, for all his reputation as a solitary thinker, valued profound connection, but he understood that true connection can only happen between individuals who are actively engaged in becoming themselves, not between masks, roles, or personas. By abandoning the 6 types that diminish you, you create space for relationships based not on need, habit, or convenience, but on mutual recognition of each other's becoming. In the end, this isn't about creating a life with fewer connections. It's about creating one with more authentic ones, not with less love, but with with more honest love, not with less community, but with community based on shared growth rather than shared limitation. Nietzsche's vision wasn't of the isolated Superman, but of individuals who had become so fully themselves that they could engage with others from abundance rather than need. If you've been struggling with relationships that diminish you, that constrain you, that drain you, perhaps Nietzsche's perspective offers a new way forward, not through confrontation or blame, but through the quiet courage of becoming so fully yourself that those who cannot accept your growth naturally fall away, while those who celebrate it naturally draw closer. Have you ever had to distance yourself from any of these 6 types of people? Or do you recognize now that there are relationships in your life that are holding you back from becoming who you might be? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel for more explorations of how philosophy can transform our everyday lives. If you found value in this video, there's another one waiting for you about how Nietzsche teaches us to transform suffering into strength. Don't miss it. Remember, abandoning what diminishes you isn't rejection, it's selection. It isn't isolation, it's curation. It isn't the end of connection. It's the beginning of authentic relationship. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next dimension.